welcome to the deep dive. We are jumping straight into some incredibly heavy, highly complex material today.
Yeah, we really are.
And we are so glad you are here with us for it. Before we get into the analysis, just a very quick request. If you appreciate the extensive, detailed research we put into unpacking these subjects for you, please take a second right now to like and subscribe.
Absolutely.
It really is the absolute best way to support the show, and it ensures we can keep bringing you these deep, unfiltered explorations of fascinating source materials.
It makes a huge difference.
It does. So today we are reviewing a massive, highly provocative ebook. The title is Grooming Gangs, A Nation's Betrayal of Its Children by Conrad Riker.
Right.
And I'll tell you right now, if you find today's analysis gripping, and I promise you it is going to be a very intense, eye-opening journey, we highly encourage you to check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy the book for yourself.
Yeah, you definitely want to read the source text.
For sure. You should also absolutely go and follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to keep up with his latest writing and research.
Well, it is definitely a text that demands a thorough, meticulous unpacking. For you listening, we know that many of you are deeply interested in the history of our modern institutions.
Yes.
Specifically, there's this growing interest in exploring the arguments surrounding how these public institutions operated before they were, as some critics argue, captured by feminist and Marxist ideologies.
Right.
And this book speaks directly to that demographic. I mean, it is explicitly written for a men's rights activist audience, and specifically for men within the so-called red-pilled manosphere.
Which is a very specific, a very vocal audience.
Exactly. These are readers who are looking for a completely unfiltered, highly critical analysis of systemic societal shifts. The author, Conrad Riker, uses the UK grooming gang scandals, which are, some of the most horrific systemic failures in modern British history, as the primary lens through which to examine these ideological shifts.
And that brings us to the mission of today's deep dive. We are exploring a text that is politically charged, raw, and completely uncompromising in its worldview.
Uncompromising is the perfect word for it.
Yeah. Riker's unpacking horrific, verified historical events in places like Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford. But he's doing it through a very specific ideological framework.
Right.
Now, before we go a single step further, we must provide a crucial impartiality disclaimer. You, the listener, need to know that we are exploring this material today purely to understand the author's arguments.
Yes.
We are not taking sides. We are not endorsing the political viewpoints, the critiques of feminism, or the condemnations of left-wing ideologies presented in the text.
We are entirely neutral here.
Completely. Our goal here is strictly analytical. We are acting as your guides, mapping out what the author is saying about the history of these public institutions, and unpacking how he claims they were captured and paralyzed by progressive ideologies.
That is a vital distinction, and it's one we will maintain throughout this entire hour. We are treating Riker's text as a primary source document.
Exactly.
We want to understand a specific, highly influential perspective that is resonating with a very large audience today. By dissecting his arguments, the evidence he chooses to highlight, and his overall rhetorical framing, we can better understand the broader cultural and political conversations happening right now.
The big picture stuff.
Right. We are looking at the massive debates regarding institutional trust, the push for traditional gender roles, and the perceived destructive impact of political correctness. We are here to examine the architecture of his argument piece by piece.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start where Riker starts, which is the sheer incomprehensible scale of the scandal.
The numbers.
The numbers, yeah. Because the statistics he presents right at the beginning of the book are absolutely staggering. He is laying out a foundation of undeniable horror.
It's a deliberate strategy.
It has to be. It feels like a way to grab the reader by the shoulders and force them to look at the magnitude of this systemic failure before he introduces any of his political theories. Let's look at Rotherham.
Okay.
He references the 2012 Times report and the subsequent 2014 independent inquiry by Professor Alexis J. And Riker highlights their finding that an estimated 1,400 children were sexually exploited in this single town over a 16-year period.
It's hard to even wrap your head around.
It really is. I just want to pause on that for you listening. 1,400 children over a decade and a half. How does a single municipality even function while that is happening right beneath the surface?
Well, that is exactly the question Riker wants you to ask.
Yeah.
He wants that number to sit uncomfortably in your mind.
Yeah.
And to compound that discomfort, he meticulously catalogs other epicenters to prove this wasn't just some bizarre, isolated anomalies specific to Rotherham.
Right, it was everywhere.
He details Rochdale, where at least 47 girls were abused, noting that some were as young as 13. He points to Oxford, a city known globally for its prestigious university and intellectual elite, where over 50 girls were systematically subjected to this horror between 2004 and 2012.
Oxford, that one really stood out to me.
Yeah. And then he brings up Telford, where the estimates, according to the sources he cites, reach up to 1,000 girls abused over the span of several decades.
Just staggering.
By stacking these statistics right in the opening chapters, Riker is immediately establishing his baseline premise. He is not talking about a few individual opportunistic criminals slipping through the cracks of a generally functional system.
No.
He is diagnosing a nationwide epidemic that was actively ignored.
It is a very effective way to open the book because you really can't argue with the horror of those numbers.
You can't.
But it also sets up a very specific challenge. He's essentially telling the reader, look at the sheer volume of victims. A tragedy on this scale could not happen unless the system itself was designed to allow it to happen. And I want to get into who exactly he is directing this challenge toward, because the preface of the book is not your standard academic introduction. It is incredibly direct, almost confrontational.
Yeah, confrontational.
He explicitly states that this book is not for the faint of heart, and it is not for people who want to live in a bubble of comfortable lies. He says, and I'm quoting here, this book is for men, real men, who value truth over comfort, who refuse to be silenced by the mob, and who are tired of seeing society crumble under ideological madness.
It's a clear call to arms.
A very clear call to arms.
He absolutely is doing that. What's fascinating here is how the author explicitly links these horrific physical crimes to abstract ideological shifts in British institutions.
Right.
Riker's core thesis is that this prolonged tragedy was not merely a failure of individual police officers or overworked social workers just being bad at their jobs. His thesis is that this was a systemic betrayal driven by three main forces.
Let's hear them.
He calls them political correctness, cowardice, and cultural relativism.
Okay, hold on. Let's define cultural relativism for the listener so we don't get bogged down in academic jargon.
Sure.
In the context of Riker's book, how is he using that term? Because it usually means understanding a culture on its own terms, but he seems to be using it as an accusation.
That is a great clarification to make. In sociology, cultural relativism is the practice of assessing a culture by its own standards rather than viewing it through the lens of one's own culture. But Riker weaponizes the term.
How so?
He argues that the authorities, the people whose explicit job it is to protect the vulnerable, used cultural relativism as an excuse for inaction. She claims they looked at the cultural backgrounds of the perpetrators and basically said, well, they have different views on women and sexuality and their culture, so we shouldn't judge them by our Western standards.
Wow.
Riker argues this mindset led institutions to prioritize the feelings of the perpetrators and the superficial optics of community cohesion over the physical, objective safety of young children.
Objects over safety.
Exactly. He is appealing to an audience that already feels modern institutions have lost their moral compass, and he is providing them with visceral, devastating evidence to support that worldview.
He frames it as a complete dereliction of duty on a societal level, and to understand how this was practically allowed to happen on the ground, Riker takes us deep into the anatomy of the gangs themselves.
Right, he doesn't just generalize.
No, he doesn't treat them as faceless boogeymen at all. He profiles the perpetrators, painting a very specific psychological and operational picture.
What does that look like?
Well, according to the text, these grooming gang members are highly narcissistic, entirely lacking in empathy, and view their victims as nothing more than disposable commodities.
They're the products.
Exactly. And he emphasizes that they aren't just chaotic, disorganized groups of street criminals. They operate in highly structured networks that are bound together by geography, by a shared cultural background, and by a fierce, almost mafia-like sense of loyalty to one another.
Yes. Riker emphasizes that these networks function almost like perverse business enterprises. He points out that they utilize a strict, efficient division of labor.
So not just one guy acting alone.
Definitely not. In his analysis, some members of the gang are solely responsible for recruiting. They are the ones who might be younger, more charismatic, using charm or manipulation to isolate a girl.
The groomers.
Right. But then, other members are tasked with the later stages, the physical coercion, the distribution of drugs or alcohol to create dependency, and the logistical nightmare of moving these girls from location to location.
Like a supply chain.
Exactly like that. He describes this as a well-oiled machine designed to maximize their horrific profits and their control while simultaneously minimizing their risk of exposure. The author wants the reader to understand that this was a highly sophisticated operation.
Right.
And in his view, the fact that it was so organized makes the institutional blindness to it all the more damning. I mean, how do you miss a coordinated criminal enterprise operating in plain sight for 16 years?
You'd have to be trying to miss it. And the intimidation tactics they use to maintain that silence, according to the book, are absolutely chilling.
It's terror.
It really is. It's not just about manipulating young girls, it's about controlling the entire environment. The book goes into specific detail about how older men in these gangs deliberately target vulnerable younger boys in their own communities, too.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, often boys from broken homes or those struggling academically or socially. They recruit these boys into the gang, luring them with promises of money, protection, power, and respect.
Bring them into the fold.
Right. But once these younger boys are in, they are trapped. They are coerced into participating in the abuse, used as tools by the older men, and effectively turned into accomplices so they can never go to the police.
Because they're guilty too.
Exactly. And the violence used against the victims themselves is severe. Riker describes how the gangs use physical beatings, explicit threats of mutilation, and even target the victims' extended families to ensure absolute silence. It's a culture of profound, paralyzing fear.
It is a deliberate, calculated strategy of terror. Riker notes that the gangs want everyone in the community to know exactly what happens to anyone who crosses them or speaks to the authorities.
Total control.
Right. But the book doesn't just look backward at the historical tactics used in the 1990s and early 2000s. Riker brings the threat right into the present day. And this is where the analysis becomes incredibly modern and, frankly, terrifying for any parent listening right now.
Oh, the digital aspect.
Yes. He shifts his focus to the digital hunting ground. He details how these predators have evolved with the times, utilizing encrypted messaging apps to coordinate their activities, share images, and avoid detection by law enforcement.
Yeah, the technology aspect is where the book hits really close to home for today's landscape.
For sure.
When Riker describes these digital predators, he isn't just talking about a historical event in the UK. He's talking about the smartphone in your kid's pocket, or the iPad sitting on your coffee table right now.
Which is terrifying.
He specifically calls out massively popular gaming platforms like Fortnite and Roblox. There is a deeply disturbing anecdote in the text about a 12-year-old boy in London who was groomed entirely through Roblox.
A 12-year-old boy.
Yeah. According to Riker, his groomer was a man in his 40s who simply created an avatar posed as a fellow gamer and spent weeks building a rapport.
Just playing games with him.
Exactly. He convinced the boy to share personal information, moved the conversation to a secondary, unmonitored chat app, and eventually manipulated the child into meeting in person. And the whole time, the parents thought their son was just playing a harmless, cartoonish video game in his bedroom.
That anecdote serves as a bridge for Riker to launch a massive critique of modern tech companies.
Oh, he goes after them hard.
He really does. He also heavily criticizes social media platforms like TikTok. He points out that kids are spending hours upon hours mindlessly scrolling, addicted to the endless feeds, completely unaware that the underlying algorithms are being actively exploited by predators to target, isolate, and manipulate them.
Just slipping right past the defenses?
It's exactly. Riker argues that the age verification systems on these platforms are a complete joke. They are easily bypassed by predators who just laugh at these so-called safeguards.
He really doesn't pull his punches with the tech industry. He states that trusting tech companies to self-regulate and protect children is like asking a fox to guard the hen house.
A great analogy for his point.
In his view, these massive, multi-billion-dollar platforms have essentially become the primary unpoliced spaces for grooming, and he argues that the corporations running them have done practically nothing of substance to stop it because their entire business model relies on user engagement.
Right, they just want the clicks.
They want eyes on the screen regardless of the danger. This ties directly back into his larger theme. Institutions, whether they are government bureaucracies or private tech monopolies, are fundamentally failing to protect the innocent because their priorities are completely misaligned with the basic safety of the public.
Exactly. And that concept of misaligned priorities is the perfect transition into the next major pillar of his argument.
Let's get into it.
So we have these highly organized predators exploiting both modern technology and physical intimidation. But that begs a massive question for you listening. Where were the cops? Where were the social workers? Why wasn't anyone stopping this?
Right.
Riker's answer to that question is perhaps the most enraging part of the book. He labels it institutional cowardice. This is where he unleashes his fury at the state apparatus, specifically the police, the local councils, and the NHS.
Let's start with law enforcement because the examples he uses are tough to even read out loud.
They are brutal.
The book is filled with visceral, infuriating accounts of police failures. In Rotherham, Riker recounts the story of a 14-year-old girl who summoned the courage to walk into a police station and report that she had been repeatedly raped by multiple men.
You'd expect immediate action.
You would think alarms would go off, protocols would be initiated, but according to the text, the response from the police officers on duty was to tell her to go home and behave.
It's just sickening.
Just dismiss her completely. In another horrific instance detailed in the book, a 12-year-old victim was explicitly told by a police officer, "You're just a prostitute."
Those specific quotes are central to Riker's argument, and he uses them very deliberately. He wants to demonstrate that the police didn't just fail to investigate due to a lack of evidence or resources.
It was an active choice.
Yes. He's arguing that they actively victim-blamed and dehumanized the children they were sworn to protect. He argues that this wasn't just a bureaucratic oversight. It was a deeply ingrained systemic culture within law enforcement that treated working-class, often troubled young girls as nuisances and troublemakers, rather than as victims of severe crime.
Rather than as children.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He is painting a picture of a police force that was morally bankrupt.
Right, and he argues that this moral bankruptcy extended well beyond the police. When you move to social services, Riker introduces another layer of failure, which he frames around something he calls the austerity trap.
Which is important to define.
Yeah, I want to make sure we define this clearly. When he talks about austerity, he's referring to the severe economic policies implemented by the UK government, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis.
The budget cuts.
Exactly. Massive cuts to public spending. Riker details how these severe budget cuts left social services in absolute shambles. In Rotherham alone, he notes that social care staffing levels were slashed by roughly 50% over a decade.
The statistics he pulls to illustrate the impact of that austerity are grim. The book states that because of these massive cuts and the resulting overwhelming, unmanageable caseloads placed on the remaining staff, only 1 in 8 grooming cases reported to social services resulted in any form of meaningful intervention.
Think about that ratio for a second, 1 in 8.
Right, that means 87% of the time a child was reported as being in danger. The system simply lacked the manpower to do anything about it.
It's a complete failure of the safety net.
He brings up a whistleblower in Bradford who revealed that physical case files were routinely lost. Not hidden in a conspiracy, but literally misplaced or abandoned, simply due to understaffing and chaos.
Just sitting in a pile somewhere.
Yeah. He paints a picture of individual social workers trying to handle upwards of 50 complex child abuse cases simultaneously, making it physically impossible to adequately protect anyone.
But I want to be clear here, because Riker doesn't let social workers off the hook just because they were underfunded.
No, he certainly doesn't.
He actually argues that austerity was only a convenient excuse. The deeper, more insidious issue, according to his thesis, was the ideological capture of these social workers. He essentially argues that even if they had unlimited funding, they still wouldn't have acted. How does he justify that claim?
He justifies it by pointing to the internal culture of these departments. Riker argues that even when social workers did have the resources and the time to investigate, they actively chose to look the other way.
Because of the culture.
Right. He quotes a former social worker who admitted on the record that they were terrified of being accused of racism if they intervened heavily in cases involving minority communities.
Wow.
They were given top-down mandates from management to be culturally sensitive. Riker translates that phrase cultural sensitivity as a bureaucratic mandate to turn a blind eye to abuse to avoid bad PR.
PR over protection again.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop with social services. He brings in the National Health Service, the NHS, to show how pervasive this bureaucratic and ideological paralysis really was across all facets of British life.
Yeah, the section on the NHS is wild. This is an institution that is practically sacred in the UK, and he just tears into it.
He holds nothing back.
Riker details a case where a 14-year-old girl walks into a public health clinic and is treated for sexually transmitted diseases on multiple separate occasions.
At 14.
At 14. And according to the book, no one asks the obvious questions. No one stops to ask how a child ended up in this situation. No one reports it to the police.
It's pure negligence.
But the most shocking claim from the book involves a specific incident with a nurse. This nurse actually did notice suspicious injuries, bruising, and signs of trauma on a young girl.
Someone finally paying attention.
Right. This nurse did what she was supposed to do. She raised concerns with her superiors about the girl's older, abusive boyfriend who was always lingering around. And what happened?
It didn't go well.
According to the text, the nurse was fired by the NHS Trust for overstepping and being culturally insensitive.
Riker uses that specific anecdote to hammer home his larger point about ideological capture. He blames the proliferation of NHS diversity training and an overarching institutional fear of racism accusations for this outcome.
The fear of the accusation was worse than the abuse.
That's his argument. He argues that the NHS has become an institution so obsessed with political correctness and public relations that it prioritizes safeguarding its own progressive reputation over safeguarding the actual physical bodies of children. He claims the red tape is so thick and the fear of HR tribunals is so high that healthcare workers are paralyzed. They are forced to follow bureaucratic protocols that demand non-judgmental cultural sensitivity rather than trusting their professional medical instincts to intervene when a child is clearly in acute danger.
And according to the book, the front line of this massive multi-agency failure was often the school.
The school, yeah.
Riker describes how teachers, headmasters, and school administrators repeatedly ignored massive screaming red flags. We're talking about scenarios where older, unrelated men were literally waiting outside the school gates in cars to pick up 13-year-old girls.
Right out in the open.
We're talking about vulnerable girls suddenly showing up to class with unexplained expensive gifts, new mobile phones, and displaying sudden, drastic changes in behavior.
Falling asleep in class?
Exactly, acting out aggressively. Yet the text claims the schools turned a blind eye. The educators were supposedly more concerned about being labeled racist by the community or by the school board than they were about calling the police.
The author is trying to paint a comprehensive, claustrophobic picture of a society where every single safety net has been systematically dismantled by a specific ideology.
Claustrophobic is a good word for it.
For the listener, Riker is asking you to put yourself in the shoes of a parent trapped in this environment. Imagine raising a child in a town where the police tell sexual assault victims to go home and behave.
Unimaginable.
Where social workers lose your child's file because they are overworked and terrified of being called racist. Where NHS nurses are fired for trying to protect your daughter. And where teachers watch predators wait at the school gates and do absolutely nothing.
He is actively cultivating a sense of profound, righteous anger on behalf of parents who rely on these institutions. He wants you to feel that the social contract has been completely broken.
Completely severed.
That perfectly sets up the core of his ideological argument. Here's where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because up until now, he's been describing the symptoms of the disease. But in Section 4, Riker names what he believes are the true culprits causing the disease: identity politics, feminism, and the left.
This is the focal point.
This is the absolute philosophical center of the book's worldview. He is viewing this entire crisis through a staunchly anti-Marxist and anti-feminist lens. This is where we really need to put on our analytical hats and look at the architecture of his argument.
Yes, this is where we must be incredibly precise in unpacking his logic. Riker posits that left-wing progressive ideologies, specifically the doctrines of multiculturalism and identity politics, fundamentally rewire the moral compass of British institutions.
Rewired them completely.
He argues that these ideologies created what he calls a perverse incentive structure. Let me explain how he defines that.
Please do.
In his view, identity politics establishes a strict hierarchy of victimhood based on race, gender, and class. He argues that this hierarchy dictated to authorities that they must avoid criticizing, policing, or offending minority communities at all costs.
Okay, so a hands-off approach.
Exactly. Why? Because under this ideological framework, minorities are always viewed as marginalized and oppressed. Therefore, he claims, the state essentially sacrificed the safety of children from the majority demographic white working-class girls in order to appease and protect the minority demographic from scrutiny.
He sees this as a direct, catastrophic result of Marxist frameworks infiltrating the civil service bureaucracy.
That is his exact claim.
Okay, I want to make sure I'm following Riker's logic here, because that is a massive, sweeping claim. He's drawing a direct line from academic sociological theories to cops ignoring rape victims.
Is a bold leap.
It is. How does he actually connect those dots when he talks about feminism specifically? Because his critique of feminism in this book is absolutely scathing.
Very harsh.
He makes the highly provocative claim that modern feminism, a movement whose entire stated historical purpose is to stand up for the rights, bodily autonomy, and safety of women and girls, was conspicuously silent when it came to the grooming gang epidemic. Why does he think that is?
He blames a specific concept within modern feminism called intersectionality.
Okay, unpack that.
For listeners who might not live and breathe academic sociology, intersectionality is basically the idea that different types of social categorization, like race, class, and gender, overlap and create interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage.
Right.
It's meant to be a tool for understanding complex social dynamics. But Riker argues that in practice, intersectionality actually blinded the progressive establishment to these victims.
Blinded them how?
He claims that because the perpetrators in these specific high-profile cases were predominantly brown men of South Asian descent, and the victims were overwhelmingly white, lower-class girls, the mainstream feminist movement couldn't fit the tragedy into their preferred, simplistic narrative of white male oppressors.
So he's saying that because the abusers weren't white men, feminists didn't know how to react, so they just ignored it.
That is exactly his argument. He argues that the victims were quietly dismissed by the progressive middle-class feminist establishment as slags or troublemakers.
Which is horrifying.
Yes. He claims that acknowledging their victimization at the hands of a minority group would violate the strict dogma of intersectionality, which, in his interpretation, dictates that minority men cannot be systemic oppressors of white women.
I see.
Therefore, he argues, the feminist movement essentially abandoned these working-class girls to protect their own academic theories.
But he goes even further than just critiquing the blind spots of modern feminism. He explicitly rejects the very concept of gender equality as a functioning societal model.
Right, he tosses it out entirely.
He argues that the push to dismantle traditional gender roles is precisely what created the societal chaos that left these children unprotected in the first place. There is a quote in the book that serves as a major cornerstone of his philosophy.
Which one?
He writes, "Men must lead, women must nurture." That is a highly controversial traditionalist stance. How does he justify that in the context of child abuse?
It is a full-throated defense of traditional patriarchy, and he frames it strictly as a protective mechanism. He is telling his audience, remember, men who feel alienated by modern society that strength, masculine leadership, and physical responsibility are not outdated, toxic concepts.
He sees them as necessary.
He argues they are the fundamental bedrock of a safe, functioning society. His justification is that when society tried to make men and women entirely interchangeable, it stripped men of their biological and cultural mandate to protect the vulnerable.
Okay.
He asserts that men are naturally inclined to protect and women are naturally inclined to nurture. He argues that pretending otherwise and neutering male authority in the home and in the community is exactly what created a vacuum of power.
And into that vacuum.
Exactly. Into that vacuum stepped these highly organized, hyper-masculine, predatory gangs who were able to operate without fear of righteous, violent intervention from the fathers and brothers of the community.
So he sees the breakdown of the traditional family unit as the ultimate vulnerability. And he applies this ideological critique not just to abstract concepts, but to actual government policy. He takes direct aim at the official Home Office report released by the UK government in 2020.
That report was highly anticipated.
Right. This report was supposed to be the definitive analysis of the group-based child sexual exploitation phenomenon. But Riker expresses immense, palpable anger that the government report actively downplayed the ethnic dimension of the grooming gangs.
He was furious.
Despite the demographic data showing that in these specific high-profile towns, the vast majority of convicted offenders were men of Pakistani descent, the Home Office report concluded that there was no clear link between ethnicity and the crime. Instead, they blamed vague concepts like cultural influences, peer pressure, and general economic hardship.
Riker calls that report a complete, cowardly betrayal of the truth. He argues that the Home Office at the highest levels of government was too terrified of being branded institutionally racist to call a problem when he believes it truly is. Deeply ingrained cultural misogyny imported from specific regions.
He doesn't accept the economic hardship argument at all.
Not for a second. He says the government deliberately diluted the truth to maintain community harmony. In his view, this effectively insults every single victim by refusing to name the specific cultural and religious dynamics that enabled their abusers.
Wow.
He insists that until society is willing to confront very uncomfortable, taboo truths about how women are viewed in certain imported cultures, the problem will never actually be solved, only managed.
And this ideological battleground naturally leads us into how the public actually consumed this information as the scandals were breaking. Riker argues that the mainstream media was just as captured by progressive ideology as the state institutions.
They are heavily targeted in the book.
Yeah, he levels severe, sustained accusations against outlets like the BBC, Channel 4, and The Guardian.
Yes, he views the media not as objective reporters, but as active participants in the cover-up. He details what he sees as a massive, unforgivable double standard in journalism.
A double standard of silence.
It's exactly. The book claims that these mainstream media outlets actively, deliberately avoided mentioning the ethnic or religious backgrounds of the grooming gang members in their reporting, even when that information was highly relevant to understanding how the criminal networks operated and hid within their own closed communities.
Right.
He argues they downplayed the crisis entirely to protect community relations and adhere to a strict code of progressive political correctness.
I want to highlight a hypothetical scenario he poses to his readers because it really crystallizes his point about media bias.
The role reversal one.
Yeah, he asks the reader to imagine if the roles were reversed. Imagine if the perpetrators had been organized, networked gangs of middle-aged white men systematically drugging, raping, and trafficking young minority girls over the course of 16 years.
It's a striking hypothetical.
Riker argues, and he's very confident in this assertion, that the media response would have been apocalyptic. He claims outlets like The Guardian would have screamed from the rooftops about the inherent dangers of toxic masculinity, the evils of the patriarchy, and the deeply rooted systemic racism of the white working class.
He envisions a totally different response.
There would be national inquiries immediately, wall-to-wall coverage, and demands for cultural re-education. But, he argues, because of the actual ethnic makeup of the perpetrators, the media chose to obfuscate, use vague terms like Asian men, which confused the public, and ultimately chose silence over truth.
He views this journalistic silence not just as professional cowardice, but as active complicity that allowed the abuse to continue for years longer than it should have.
Yeah.
However, the book takes a very nuanced, somewhat surprising turn when examining the reaction for the extremes of the political spectrum. Because the mainstream media and the state institutions left a massive vacuum of silence, Riker acknowledges that the far right stepped in to fill it. He discusses the involvement of controversial, often militant groups like the English Defense League, the EDL, the British National Party, and provocative figures like Tommy Robinson.
This part of the book is really interesting because you might assume, given his heavy critique of the left, that he would just blindly praise these right-wing groups for speaking out.
But he doesn't.
No, he doesn't. He does acknowledge their effectiveness, though. He admits that when the BBC was ignoring the story, it was the far-right activists who actually took to the streets with smartphones.
Doing the groundwork.
Yeah, they were the ones interviewing the victims, sharing the horrifying testimonies online, and circumventing the traditional media gatekeepers. He admits that they organized loud, disruptive marches in places like Rotherham and Rochdale, which, love them or hate them, successfully forced the issue into the national spotlight.
They brought undeniable attention to the systemic failures when polite society refused to look. That is true. He credits them with breaking the seal of silence. But, and this is a crucial, but in understanding Riker's overall thesis, he ultimately condemns the far right's methods and their underlying motivations.
How so?
He describes their approach using a very specific metaphor. He says they used a sledgehammer to crack a nut. He points out that the far right exploited the profound trauma of these children for their own cynical, pre-existing anti-immigration and anti-Islamic political gain.
Just using them.
Exactly. They frequently spread misinformation, exaggerated details to fit their racial narratives, and used deeply divisive, violently confrontational rhetoric.
So he basically says they weaponized the trauma of these girls to sow chaos and push their own toxic worldview.
Yeah.
He argues that by turning a complex child protection crisis into a circus of racial hatred and street brawls, the far right actually did a disservice to the victims. They alienated the moderate, sensible people in the communities who needed to be engaged, gave the authorities an excuse to focus on right-wing extremism instead of child abuse, and ultimately made rational, nuanced discourse completely impossible.
it poisoned the well.
Oh, if we look at his whole map here, he's hitting the progressive left for their cowardly, ideologically driven silence, and he's hitting the far right for their reckless, opportunistic exploitation.
And caught directly in the middle of all this political maneuvering, completely abandoned by everyone, are the victims themselves.
The actual girls.
Which brings us to the agonizing reality of what happened when these cases finally did make it to the justice system. Riker argues that the courts were just as infected by this ideological cowardice as the police and social services.
It just doesn't stop.
It doesn't. He portrays the judiciary as a system in a state of moral crisis, delivering infuriating, inexplicable leniency to convicted predators.
The examples he provides regarding sentencing are clearly designed to provoke sheer, unadulterated outrage in the reader.
And they succeed.
He highlights a specific case in Rochdale where an abuser, convicted of participating in the organized rape of a 13-year-old girl, received just 6 years in prison.
6 years?
In Rotherham, he points to a ringleader convicted of multiple counts of rape, trafficking, and conspiracy who received only 4 years.
4 years for that level of organized crime.
Riker intentionally juxtaposes these shockingly low sentences against the time people serve for white-collar crimes like tax evasion or non-violent drug offenses, which frequently carry much heavier penalties.
He uses that juxtaposition to argue that this leniency sends a clear, devastating message from the highest levels of the state. He argues the judiciary is effectively stating that the lives, bodies, and futures of working-class girls are considered cheap, disposable commodities by the establishment.
That the state just doesn't value them.
Yes. He views the justice system as fundamentally rigged to protect the perpetrators, heavily influenced, once again, by a systemic fear among judges of appearing culturally insensitive, Islamophobic, or overly punitive toward minorities.
And the toll this institutional abandonment takes on the victims is horrific. Riker spends a significant portion of the book discussing the long-term devastation, pointing out that the trauma absolutely didn't end when the physical abuse stopped, or when the gavels came down in court.
The aftermath is just as dark.
He details the agonizing aftermath. He mentions a victim in Rotherham who, after bravely testifying, was forced to physically move away from her hometown. Why? Because she was receiving constant, credible death threats from her abuser's extended family who still lived down the street.
And the authorities did nothing.
And the police either couldn't or wouldn't provide her with adequate protection.
He also highlights the severe social stigma these girls faced, which compounded their trauma. Because the media and the local authorities had spent years labeling them troublemakers, runaways, or implying they were complicit, they were often ostracized by their own communities.
Blamed for their own abuse.
Exactly. He mentions one deeply tragic case of a victim who was completely disowned by her own family for speaking out and bringing shame to the area. She was abandoned to face severe, crippling PTSD, chronic depression, anxiety, and severe substance abuse issues entirely alone.
Just left to fend for herself.
Riker wants the reader to fully emotionally grasp that the state didn't just fail to prevent the abuse. They actively, systematically abandoned the survivors to rot in the aftermath.
It is an incredibly bleak, pessimistic picture of modern society.
It really is.
But Riker doesn't just leave the reader in a state of despair or nihilism. He actually pivots in the final chapters to outline what he sees as the only path forward. He lays out his blueprint for change and his vision for reclaiming the narrative.
Right. He has solutions.
And true to form, he outlines a series of strict, unyielding, highly controversial demands for reform in the future. Let's walk through them. First and foremost, he demands that society, specifically the media and the government, must publicly acknowledge the uncomfortable facts about the ethnic background of the perpetrators in these historical cases without any fear of being labeled racist.
He believes absolute, unfiltered truth must precede any policy changes.
Yes, he argues you cannot fix a problem you refuse to name.
Secondly, he calls for the absolute ruthless eradication of political correctness, diversity training, and cultural relativism within all public institutions.
A total purge of the ideology.
Yes. He argues that the singular, overriding, guiding principle for police, nurses, and social workers must be objective child safety, regardless of whose cultural, religious, or political sensibilities might be offended in the process. Furthermore, he demands harsh, unprecedented legal accountability.
This part is wild.
It is. He proposes that local council officials, police chiefs, and hospital administrators should be held personally, legally responsible. He suggests they should potentially face criminal negligence charges and prison time themselves if it can be proven that they knowingly allowed child exploitation to occur in their jurisdictions due to political cowardice or a desire to protect their department's reputation.
I mean, could you imagine the legal precedent that would set? Holding a mayor or a police chief criminally liable for the actions of a gang because they fostered a culture of silence? It's a radical demand, but it speaks to the level of anger his audience
But it's
feels.
born out of that frustration.
He also targets the digital realm we talked about earlier. He demands that the government step in to mandate and rigorously enforce strict age verification systems on the internet. He point blank refuses to accept the idea of letting tech companies self regulate anymore.
Because they've proven they won't.
Exactly, demanding that platforms like Roblox and TikTok be held legally liable for grooming that occurs on their watch.
But perhaps the most resonant, emotionally charged part of his blueprint, especially for his specific red-pilled, male-centric audience, is his intense focus on the role of parents, and specifically fathers.
Yes, the final anecdote.
He shares a very powerful, visceral anecdote toward the end of the book about a father who realized his teenage daughter was being groomed and was currently in danger at a local suspected trap house. According to Riker, this father didn't wait on hold for the police.
No.
He didn't file a report with social services. He gathered some friends, drove to the house, kicked the door in himself, and physically dragged his daughter out of the den of abusers.
For Riker, that father isn't a vigilante. He represents the ultimate moral ideal. He views parents, specifically strong, unapologetically protective fathers, willing to use force if necessary, as the absolute first line of defense in a society where public institutions have proven themselves to be utterly corrupt and untrustworthy.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of Riker's philosophy, we see what he's really after. He's not just asking for better policing or slightly reformed social work protocols.
No, it's much bigger than that.
He is ultimately calling for a massive structural cultural reset. He is explicitly advocating for a return to traditional patriarchal protective roles. He wants a complete ground-up overhaul of how our institutions operate, demanding a system that ruthlessly, unapologetically prioritizes objective truth and the physical safety of citizens over public relations, optics, and ideological purity.
So what does this all mean? As we bring this incredibly intense, demanding deep dive to a close, we have to reflect on the value of examining a text like this. Riker's book is raw, it is highly polarized, and it pulls absolutely no punches.
It is designed to make you angry.
It is. But understanding perspectives like his is absolutely crucial if we want to comprehend the deep, seemingly unbridgeable fractures in modern society. This book provides a very clear, highly detailed map of why there is such a profound, widespread erosion of trust in public institutions right now.
Exactly.
It perfectly articulates the driving forces, the historical grievances, and the philosophical arguments fueling the manosphere and broader anti-establishment movements.
Precisely. By reading this text, we understand exactly how a significant, growing portion of the population views the state, the media, and modern progressive ideology. They view it not just with mild skepticism, but with absolute moral condemnation, basing that condemnation on the very real, undeniable tragedies of Rotherham, Rochdale, and Telford.
The facts anchor the ideology.
Right. It forces anyone studying society to reckon with the catastrophic consequences of institutional failure, and to understand the powerful, reactive narratives that rise up in the wake of that failure. You cannot understand modern populist movements without understanding the anger stemming from these specific scandals.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over on your own as you go about your day.
Okay.
Riker argues extensively that a decade ago, an institutional fear of public backlash, specifically the paralyzing fear among bureaucrats of being labeled racist by the progressive left, caused authorities to freeze, look the other way, and fail thousands of children. Think about the world we live in today.
It's very different.
We are in an era of hyper-viral social media outrage, where public shaming, cancellation, and professional ruin happen at the speed of light on platforms like X and TikTok.
Instantly.
How is that toxic, hyper-reactive environment shaping the decisions being made by our police officers, our teachers, and our social workers today? Are we building robust, courageous systems that are genuinely optimized to protect the vulnerable, no matter the cost to their own reputations? Or have we inadvertently created a society of bureaucrats where every system is optimized solely to survive the next PR crisis?
It is a vital, terrifying question. Because if the primary unspoken priority of a bureaucracy is self-preservation in the face of public opinion, then the actual fundamental execution of its duties will always be compromised. Riker's historical analysis of these grooming gangs serves as a dark, urgent warning about what happens when optics replace ethics.
Exactly. Thank you so much for taking this intense deep dive with us today. Just a reminder, if you want to read the source material and explore these complex arguments in full detail for yourself, go to Amazon Kindle and Google Playbooks to buy Grooming Gangs, A Nation's Betrayal of Its Children by Conrad Riker.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to stay updated on his work.
Please remember to like and subscribe to our show so we can keep bringing you these deep analytical dives into the ideas shaping our world. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and take care of yourselves.